Deb McGregor, you're Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York University's Osgoode Hall Law Faculty, and Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island, Ontario. Deb, our class introduces students to the scope and seriousness of present ecological problems and has them explore the prevailing human-nature relationships undergirding both environmental degradation and sustainability. I wonder if you could speak to us about the human-nature relationship we would need today from your own perspective as a professor, environmentalist, and as a First Nations person.
Well, that's a huge question, and one, if anybody has it, should actually win a Nobel Prize for or something like that. So it's like, I can offer you.
We got 7 days. So.
Yeah, okay. Great. And then, yeah, we can solve this COVID thing while we're at it. So I guess there'd be a number of things that I would say in terms of different philosophies that I've been sort of paying attention to actually a lot lately, because of, the piece that I wrote for Earth Day, because it was like 50 years of celebrating Earth Day, right? In 2020. So they wanted to know, well, what did that mean? And I said, well, the first time they celebrated it, they didn't think about Indigenous people at all. And so, and then later on, like, people started to figure out, oh, maybe we should talk to the people kind of who were here living sustainably for thousands of years. Maybe they have something to say about how to live in coexistence with Mother Earth, which is one way of describing, I guess, human nature kind of relationships. And the way that I think about it is, I think this is true for everyone if they go far back enough. It's like really, it's more actually than reconnecting. It's actually trying to reconnect in the appropriate way. People say, well, I got to connect. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, people probably think they're connecting when they're doing forestry or they're doing some sort of resource extraction, right? It's just like not a great kind of connection.
Right.
So I kind of think of it as being more of trying to live in relationship or in coexistence with Mother Earth. But there's a number of assumptions you have to have before this kind of makes sense. And one of them is recognizing that the Earth has agency. So the Earth has a say in what's going on. Scholars like M.A. Kraft, who's at the University of Ottawa, and Anishinaabe Métis scholar, says that Earth is actually a legal entity and actually governs people. So when we have, like what we saw in Ottawa, she's at the University of Ottawa, all the floods, she goes, water was actually governing people. Water was causing people to behave in certain ways. Humans thought it was most inconvenient, but water was asserting what she calls its jurisdiction, right? So there's a number of assumptions that you have about the Earth when we talk about human nature relationships. Like, even what do we even mean by humanity? Are we part of nature or aren't we? So a lot of people will say, yes, we are, but we don't act like it. So I call it I guess different, like trying to understand what that is visually. Like, what does that look like when we say that we're part of nature? Like, what does that mean? So it means we're trying to understand ourselves, and maybe as humanity, we actually don't have a great understanding of ourselves, really. Like, it's better to try to figure out what nature is and construct what that is, or environment, or Mother Earth, or planet, whatever we want to call it. But in thinking about humanity, like what that model would look like that I've seen in the UN and other places is, I call it the M&M metaphor. So if you know what an M&M looks like, all my metaphors are like food related, especially because I really like chocolate. So M&M, the candy.
Okay, that's cool.
The peanuts in the middle, and that would be people, right? And so people are willing to recognize, yeah, there's people, but there's still kind of a separation, because in the environment or nature is like the chocolate coating, right? And with the pretty colors. So there's still, like, it's one thing, an M&M, and it wouldn't be an M&M without the peanut and without the chocolate, the pretty color. But they're still kind of separate. And so the metaphor that I use to try to explain, like, how Indigenous peoples, as I understand it, like even, and way I try to understand this, because I guess the first thing to say is Indigenous peoples are diverse about how they express this through their own languages and culture and nation. and laws. But I look at the international declarations and I look to see what do they say. So all these indigenous people come from all over the world, like at the Earth Summit in 1992 and climate change summits, and they generate their own declarations. So I look at those and I look at the content, I look at the discourse. And what I find is this, total recognition that we're part of it, but not in the M&M kind of way. It's more like in the macaroon kind of way. So the macaroon, again, my chocolate, coconut, which I love. So the coconut's embedded within the chocolate, right? Like it's impossible to separate. You can separate the peanut from the chocolate in the M&M, but you can't, like if you take out the coconut from the macaroon, then it's not a macaroon anymore. If you take out the chocolate and just have the coconut, it's not a macaroon. You need to actually have both of them there, and you can't like pick them out because it's impossible to do that. And then it's a macaroon. So those kind of metaphors to me explain kind of that difference about what does it mean, like in terms of worldview and philosophy and set of assumptions, to understand what does it mean to say that we're actually part of the land, and we're part of the world, and we're part of nature. Again, in Indigenous conceptions, it's a lot broader than that because it also relates back to our ancestors. So it's also time becomes part of it. Who we are as present generations is very relevant, and who our ancestors were, what kind of descendants we are, what kind of ancestors we're going to be to future generations. A lot of conceptions of nature don't consider our conceptions of time within embedded within that concept. So in talking about human nature relationships, there's always these set of assumptions that inform how you understand it. Those are just ways that I try to explain it to students of like what do we say when we say, yeah, people are part of nature, but then the laws that we create, like we as in collectively Canada and other nation states, don't reflect that understanding at all. So if you go to, I guess now there's been an environmental reform, it's the Impact Assessment Act, not the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and look to see how environment's defined. It's not including people. And federal is different than provincial, so we know that people are constructing this idea of what nature and environment is. The other story that I tell is when I worked in this field for many years, worked for Environment Canada, worked for First Nations, is going to Akwesasne. And at the time, Environment Canada, now they're called Environment Canada and Climate Change, when they were developing the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, had negotiated with the Department of National Defence what the concept of environment was. And it was a major coup for Environment Canada at the time to have air included as part of that. And we can't imagine, like, how would air not be part of what we consider to be nature or the environment? But because of mandates and jurisdiction and everything else, DND had to agree that, because that's their mandate, right, airspace, to have air actually being included as part of that definition. So they were joyfully telling us this. Henry Lickers, then the director of environment for Mohawks of Akwesasne, said, well, we noticed in your definition you don't have the sun and the moon and the stars, because they're part of the Thanksgiving address, which is, Haudenosaunee sort of concept of environment. You don't have the ancestors, you don't have the four beings. Like, there was all these elements that were missing from their concept and how they were constructing environment and nature. So I wouldn't say that those are wrong. I'm just saying they're too limiting to really capture some of underlying assumptions about what we even understand who we are in relation to nature, even trying to construct this idea, what do we even mean by nature and environment? Do we understand it to be something we have a right to, or do we understand it something that we're in relation to and coexist with, which is a different way of, you would have a different governance and legal system if you understood your relationship in that kind of way. So, so for example, in terms of the law way, and sorry, I'm babbling on here a lot. You have a chance to interject. So if we were thinking about what the legal orders would look like, so in the Anishinaabe tradition, so scholars like John Burroughs and May Craft and others write about this, is our legal system is then based on a set of obligations and responsibilities to the earth, to the water, to the earth. It's not defined in terms of, okay, we have the right to clear cut, we have the right to build this dam. It's more because this worldview and these set of assumptions, philosophical ways of relating, set up a legal and governance system that looks very different. It's responsibility based, a set of duties and obligations that are actually reciprocal. It's not just one way. So, so that's kind of how you start to see that. You start to kind of see how a different society could be structured based on how you understand, like, really that fundamental kind of relationship.
What sort of obligation does water have to humans?
Water has, its duty is to give life. So when we, and this is where rights can become part of it. So water has obligations and duties to give life, not only to people. We tend to be very, full of ourselves as humanity and think we're the center of the universe. But that's the other thing about Indigenous worldviews, we're not. We're the ones who need the most teaching and guidance for how to behave appropriately. So water has this obligation and duty and responsibility to support life, not just for people, but for fish, for aquatic life, for the medicines. And water is actually, the closest relationship that water has is actually with the moon, not people. And we don't have the right to interfere with that relationship. And so we don't have the right to interfere with water's obligations to give life. When we do, like we do stupid stuff like contaminate or build a dam, and then, mercury ends up accumulating on the other side and fish can't get up, then we've kind of violated water's rights, and water is no longer able to do what it's supposed to do, which is to give life. Water can then harm. In the broader realm of like human rights, so human rights is, as we know, extraordinarily helpful and extraordinarily needed. We just have to look to see what's going on in the US to kind of see basic human rights have to be met for people. But in the United Nations, in 2010, 2011, it came forward a resolution that human beings had the right to water. Extraordinary, because you would think it would happen sooner. And it was, very much taken up by Indigenous peoples, because there's, a water crisis in Canada, and, US, other Indigenous nations and other peoples, vulnerable and marginalized, experience this as well. But then the human rights framework frames it as we have a right to water, not we should be in relationship to water. So even the human rights framework is a bit limited in terms of how we understand what that relationship. And I would never say it's not helpful. It is. Like, clearly, there's major human rights violations going on all over the world all the time. And there's a lot of people who are dealing with horrifying things in relation to their access to water. But it was really trying to force nation states to then step up and make sure that citizens have access to water. But that's a different framing, right? Because that separates people from water. Because you're, as a person or humanity, you have a right to water, which you do, but you're not even recognizing that water then has a reciprocal obligation and responsibility. We also have a responsibility to water. Water isn't going to be able to do its thing unless we have an appropriate relationship.